Snow fell hard over Blackwood territory the night everything changed, and Elena knew, before anyone said a word, that she was about to lose everything she had ever loved. She stood in the great hall with her arms wrapped around herself, watching Alpha Marcus pace in front of the fire, his jaw tight, his eyes refusing to meet hers. The pack had gathered in a wide circle, silent, waiting for him to speak, and Elena could feel every stare pressing against her skin like something sharp. "Elena," Marcus finally said, his voice low and rough, "you are no longer fit to raise our pups." The words landed like a blow. Elena's knees buckled, but she forced herself to stay standing, because an Omega who fell to the floor in front of the pack would never be respected again, not even in memory. She looked past Marcus to where Cassia stood near the hearth, arms folded, a small and satisfied curve at the corner of her mouth. Elena had known Cassia was working against her for months. She simply had never imagined Marcus would let it go this far. "What have I done?" Elena asked, keeping her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "That makes me unfit to raise my own children?" Marcus finally looked at her, and for one moment, she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something that looked almost like doubt. But then Cassia stepped forward, resting a hand lightly on his arm, and the moment passed. "There have been reports," Cassia said smoothly, "of Elena leaving the pups unattended, of strange scents near the nursery, of things going missing from the healer's stores. We cannot ignore signs like these, Alpha." Elena's stomach turned to ice. She had never left her pups unattended, not once, not even for a moment. She opened her mouth to protest, to demand proof, to ask why no one had come to her directly with these accusations before dragging her in front of the entire pack to be judged. But pack law was pack law, and an Omega speaking out of turn against a Beta in front of the Alpha was seen as further proof of instability. She had learned that lesson early, the hard way, from her own mother. "I would never harm my pups," Elena said instead, her voice trembling now despite her best effort to keep it firm. "I would die before I let anything happen to Ivy or Rowan. You know this, Marcus. You know me." Marcus's throat worked as he swallowed. For a long moment the hall was silent, except for the crackle of the fire, and the soft whimper of wind outside pressing against the windows. Elena searched his face for the man who had once pulled her into his arms beneath a summer moon, and promised her forever. She searched for the father who had wept with joy the night their twins were born. She found only the Alpha now, the one who had to answer to the pack, the one who could not afford to look weak in front of a Beta as ambitious as Cassia. "The decision has been made," Marcus said, and his voice cracked on the last word, though he tried to disguise it as anger. "You will leave Blackwood Lands tonight. You will not attempt to see the pups. This is final." A murmur rippled through the gathered wolves. Some looked away in discomfort. Others, loyal to Cassia or simply afraid to challenge the Alpha's word, nodded along as though this was justice being served. Elena searched the crowd for a single face that might stand up for her, a single voice that might ask for evidence, for a trial, for anything resembling fairness. She found none. Loyalty in a pack this size was often only as strong as fear allowed it to be, and fear of Cassia's tongue had spread through Blackwood like a slow poison for a long time. "Please," Elena said, hating how small her voice sounded, "let me say goodbye to them. Let me hold them one more time." Marcus's hands curled into fists at his sides. For a moment, Elena thought he might refuse even this, might turn his back completely, and walk away without another word. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded toward the nursery door. 5 minutes, he said. No more. Elena did not wait to be told twice. She crossed the hall quickly, aware of every eye following her, and pushed open the nursery door with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped the handle. Inside, the room was warm and dim, lit only by a small lantern near the twin cradles. Ivy and Rowan lay sleeping, their small chests rising and falling in gentle rhythm, their tiny faces peaceful and unaware of the storm breaking apart their family just beyond the door. Elena knelt beside the cradles and reached out with trembling fingers, brushing each of their soft cheeks in turn. Ivy stirred slightly, her tiny hand curling around Elena's finger in her sleep, and something inside Elena's chest cracked wide open. She pressed her lips to each small forehead, breathing in the scent of them, memorizing it, knowing this might be the last time she would ever be allowed close enough to do so. "I will come back for you," she whispered, so quietly that even her own ears barely caught the words. No matter what they say, no matter how far they send me, I am your mother, and nothing will ever change that. I promise you both, I will find a way back. Behind her, the door creaked open. Elena did not need to turn to know it was Marcus standing there, watching, his presence heavy and complicated in the doorway. She rose slowly to her feet, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, refusing to let him see just how deeply this was breaking her. "Take care of them," she said, not looking at him, staring instead at the twins sleeping peacefully, blissfully unaware. "Whatever else you believe about me, know that I have never wanted anything in this world more than I wanted to be their mother." Marcus said nothing. Elena walked past him, out through the nursery door, through the great hall where the pack still watched in uncomfortable silence, and out into the freezing night. The cold hit her like a wall, sharp and merciless, but it was nothing compared to the ache spreading through her chest. She did not look back. She could not. If she looked back, she was certain she would fall apart completely, and she refused to give Cassia the satisfaction of watching her break. The packland stretched wide and dark around her, the forest black against a sky heavy with snow clouds. Elena walked without any real direction, her boots crunching through the thin layer of frost already gathering on the ground, her breath coming out in visible white puffs. She did not know where she would go. She had no pack to call her own now, no rank, no protection. An Omega alone in winter, cast out with nothing but the clothes on her back, was as vulnerable as prey walking straight into a hunter's path. But even as fear crept in at the edges of her thoughts, something steadier rose beneath it, something Elena recognized as her grandmother's voice, echoing from years long past. Her grandmother had been an Omega too, and a healer, one of the last to carry the old knowledge of the forest, knowledge that had nothing to do with rank or pack politics, and everything to do with survival, with patience, with quiet strength that outlasted cruelty. "You are not weak because they call you weak," her grandmother used to say, brushing Elena's hair by candlelight when she was still a pup herself. "You are strong because you endure what would break lesser wolves, and you rise again every single time." Elena repeated those words to herself now, over and over, like a heartbeat keeping her moving forward through the snow. She would not simply disappear into the wilderness and let herself be forgotten. She would find shelter. She would survive. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the grief and the anger and the aching loss of her children, a quiet certainty began to form, one she could not yet explain, but could feel taking root all the same. Something was wrong back at Blackwood, something beyond her own banishment. She had seen it in the way Cassia's eyes had gleamed just a little too brightly when the accusations were read aloud, the way her explanations came a little too smoothly, a little too prepared, as though she had been waiting for the right moment to unleash them for weeks. Elena had spent months noticing small things around the pack she could never quite explain. Missing herbs from the healer's stores, strange marks in the mud near the nursery window that did not match anyone's usual scent, a restlessness in Ivy and Rowan some nights that no amount of rocking or singing seemed to soothe. She had tried to raise her concerns once, gently, to Marcus, but he had been consumed with pack matters at the time, territory disputes with a neighboring pack, and had brushed her worries aside as new mother nerves. Elena had let it go, trusting that whatever unease she felt was simply the natural anxiety of caring for two vulnerable pups in a world full of danger. Now, walking alone into the freezing dark with nothing left to lose, she wondered if she had been wrong to dismiss her instincts so easily. The wind picked up, biting through her thin clothing, and Elena pulled her arms tighter around herself, forcing her feet to keep moving, even as exhaustion and cold began to weigh her down. She thought of an old trapper's cabin her grandmother had once shown her, deep in the woods along the edge of Blackwood territory, abandoned for decades but still standing, still offering some measure of shelter from the storm. It was a long walk, hours at least in this weather, but it was somewhere to survive the night, and survival was the only thing Elena could afford to think about now. As she walked, memories rose unbidden, memories of happier times that felt almost like they belonged to someone else's life. The night Marcus had first shifted beside her under a full moon, and laughed with pure joy at the freedom of running together through the trees. The morning Ivy and Rowan had been born, two tiny wailing bundles that had somehow, impossibly, made Elena's heart grow twice its size in an instant. The quiet evenings rocking her pups to sleep while Marcus watched from the doorway, his expression soft in a way he rarely allowed anyone else to see. All of that felt like a lifetime ago now, shattered by lies she had not yet been given the chance to disprove. Elena wiped angrily at the tears freezing on her cheeks and forced her mind back to the present, back to the immediate task of survival. Grief could come later, when she was safe, when she had the luxury of falling apart without it costing her life. Hours passed, though Elena lost precise track of how many, before the outline of the old cabin finally emerged through the trees ahead, its roof sagging under years of neglect, but its walls still standing solid against the storm. Relief flooded through her, so intense it nearly buckled her knees again, and she pushed forward the last stretch of distance with renewed energy, driven purely by the promise of shelter. The cabin door stuck stubbornly at first, swollen with age and damp, but Elena threw her shoulder against it until it finally gave way with a groan, revealing a small, dusty interior, untouched by anyone in what looked like years. Cobwebs stretched across the corners, and a thick layer of dust coated every surface, but the roof was intact, and the walls blocked the worst of the wind. Elena stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her, sinking down against it as her legs finally gave out beneath her. For a long moment, she simply sat there in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside, feeling the ache in her chest threaten to swallow her whole. Then, slowly, she allowed herself to cry, silent tears that had been held back through sheer force of will since the moment Marcus first spoke those terrible words in the great hall. She cried for her pups, for the family she had lost, for the injustice of accusations she had never been given the chance to answer, and for the terrifying uncertainty of what came next. But even as she wept, that quiet certainty from earlier remained lodged firmly in her chest, refusing to be washed away by grief. Something was wrong at Blackwood. Something dangerous was moving beneath the surface of pack politics, something Cassia was orchestrating with careful precision, and Elena's banishment had not been an accident born of misunderstanding. It had been a calculated step in a larger plan, one that Elena feared, with a mother's unshakable instinct, might still put her children in terrible danger, even now that she was gone. She thought of the mother bond, the invisible thread that connected an omega to her pups no matter the distance between them, a bond so old and so deeply woven into wolf nature that even pack law could not sever it completely. Elena closed her eyes and reached inward, searching for that familiar warmth, that steady thrum of connection that told her Ivy and Rowan were safe and well. She found it, faint but present, and allowed herself a small measure of relief. Whatever happens, she told herself, wiping her tears away and forcing herself back onto unsteady feet, I will not simply disappear into these woods and let them forget me. I will survive this cold. I will find a way to watch over my pups, even from a distance, even without the pack's permission. And if my instincts are right, if something truly is wrong back at Blackwood, I will be ready to act the moment they need me most. Outside, the storm continued to rage, snow piling higher against the cabin's weathered walls, burying the forest in a thick white silence. Elena found an old wool blanket tucked away in a corner chest, moth-eaten but still warm enough to wrap around her shivering shoulders, and settled into a corner of the cabin to wait out the worst of the night. Sleep did not come easily, haunted as she was by the image of her pups' sleeping faces and the sound of Marcus's voice condemning her in front of the entire pack. But beneath the exhaustion and grief, something else was beginning to stir within Elena, something sharper and more determined than simple sorrow. It was the same quiet strength her grandmother had spoken of so long ago, the strength that rose every single time life tried to break her completely. Elena did not yet know what lay ahead, could not have imagined the danger already closing in around her children back at Blackwood, or the desperate journey through snow and darkness that awaited her in the days to come. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was not finished fighting for her family, not by a long way. As the storm finally began to quiet in the earliest hours before dawn, Elena drifted into an uneasy sleep, one hand curled protectively against her chest, as though she still held her pups close, and somewhere far away, back within the walls of Blackwood, the first signs of the true danger threatening Ivy and Rowan had already begun to show themselves in ways no one within the pack yet understood. The first sign came 3 days after Elena's banishment, so small at first that the pack healer nearly dismissed it entirely. Rowan, usually the more energetic of the twins, refused his morning feeding, turning his small face away with a whimper that struck the nursemaid, a gentle older wolf named Nora, as strange enough to mention to Marcus directly. "He's likely just fussy," Marcus said, though something in his chest tightened uncomfortably at the report. He had barely slept since Elena left, his mind circling endlessly around the decision he had made, the way her eyes had looked at him in that final moment, before she disappeared into the storm. He told himself repeatedly that he had done what pack law required, what the evidence Cassia presented demanded of him as alpha, but the doubt refused to loosen its grip. By the following evening, Ivy had also stopped feeding properly, and both twins had developed a low fever that no amount of cooling cloths seemed to ease. Nora grew increasingly alarmed, summoning the pack healer, an elderly wolf named Edward, who had tended Blackwood's sick and injured for over 3 decades. Edward examined the twins carefully, his weathered hands gentle, as he checked their small bodies for any obvious cause, but found nothing that matched any illness he recognized. "It could simply be a passing sickness," Edward said cautiously to Marcus that night, though his brow remained furrowed with concern. "Pups their age catch things easily. We will watch them closely and adjust treatment as needed." Marcus nodded, forcing down the unease twisting in his gut, and retreated to his study rather than sit in the nursery watching his children suffer, while feeling utterly powerless to help them. He told himself the sickness would pass, that Edward's decades of experience would see the twins through whatever this was. But sleep continued to elude him, and more than once during those long, restless nights, he found himself thinking of Elena, of the gentle, instinctive way she always seemed to know exactly what her pups needed, before they even cried for it. Cassia visited the nursery often during those days, always offering soft words of comfort to Nora, always positioning herself helpfully close to Marcus whenever he came to check on the twins. "You did the right thing," she told him one evening, resting a hand lightly on his arm, as they stood outside the nursery door, listening to Ivy's weak, fretful cries. "An unstable mother would only have made things worse. This illness has nothing to do with your decision." Marcus wanted desperately to believe her, but something about the timing gnawed at him uncomfortably, a coincidence too precise to entirely ignore. The twins had been perfectly healthy right up until Elena's banishment. Now, mere days later, they were fading before his eyes, and no explanation Edward or Cassia offered seemed to fully satisfy the growing unease building steadily inside him. By the 5th day, the twins' condition had worsened considerably. Both had grown listless, barely responding, even when Nora sang the lullabies that had once soothed them so easily. Their small bodies felt too warm to the touch, their breathing shallow, and labored in a way that sent real fear rippling through the entire pack household. Edward tried every remedy in his considerable arsenal: herbal poultices, cooling baths, careful doses of medicine passed down through generations of pack healers, but nothing seemed to slow the strange wasting sickness consuming the pups from within. Marcus began spending every waking hour in the nursery, watching helplessly as his children grew weaker, his guilt over Elena's banishment tangling painfully with his terror at watching Ivy and Rowan slip further from him with each passing hour. He had lost his mate, cast her out based on evidence he now increasingly suspected had been manufactured, and now he feared he might lose his children as well, unable to do anything but sit beside their cradles and pray to whatever forces governed fate that they would somehow find the strength to recover. "There must be something more we can try," Marcus said desperately to Edward one night, his voice raw with exhaustion and fear. Edward's weathered face was grim as he shook his head slowly. "I have tried everything within my knowledge, Alpha," Edward admitted, his own frustration evident. "Whatever afflicts them, it does not match any illness I have encountered in all my years of healing. I fear we may need knowledge beyond what I possess." Those words haunted Marcus long after Edward left the nursery for the night. Knowledge beyond what Edward possessed. Marcus thought immediately, painfully, of Elena, of her grandmother's teachings, the old Omega healing traditions Elena had spoken of occasionally throughout their years together, traditions that predated even Edward's considerable pack knowledge. He had never paid much attention to those stories at the time, dismissing them as quaint remnants of old superstition rather than genuine medicine. Now, watching his children fight for every shallow breath, Marcus found himself desperately wishing he had listened more closely, had asked Elena more questions about the healing knowledge her grandmother had passed down to her. But Elena was gone, banished into the wilderness on his own order, and pack law forbade any contact between them regardless of circumstance. Even if Marcus wanted to seek her out now, to beg for whatever knowledge might save their children, tradition and law stood firmly in his way. Cassia noticed his growing desperation and moved carefully to reinforce her position within the pack, offering constant reassurance while subtly discouraging any talk of reaching out beyond Blackwood's borders for additional help. Bringing in outside healers would only create panic among the pack, she argued, during a tense meeting of the pack council. We must trust in Edward's expertise and give the treatments time to work. Some council members nodded in agreement, trusting Cassia's counsel, as they always had. Others, watching Marcus's increasingly haggard appearance and the twins' worsening condition, exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing, unwilling to challenge either the alpha or his influential beta directly. Marcus, torn between his responsibility to maintain pack stability and his desperate need to save his children, found himself increasingly unable to think clearly, exhaustion and grief clouding every decision. On the 7th night since Elena's banishment, a fierce storm rolled into Blackwood territory, far more violent than the one that had accompanied Elena's departure. Wind howled around the pack house with tremendous force, rattling windows and stripping branches from ancient trees throughout the surrounding forest. Marcus sat beside the twins' cradles as he had every night that week, watching their small chests rise and fall with increasingly shallow breaths, praying silently that they would somehow make it through until morning. Exhaustion finally overwhelmed him sometime past midnight, his eyes drifting closed despite his best efforts to remain alert. He woke with a violent start, hours later, to the sound of shattering glass and Nora's terrified scream echoing through the pack house. Marcus was on his feet instantly, adrenaline surging through his exhausted body as he rushed toward the nursery, his heart pounding with a fear more intense than anything he had experienced in years. He burst through the nursery door to a scene of complete chaos. The window stood shattered, cold wind and snow pouring into the room, curtains torn and whipping violently in the storm. Nora stood frozen near the doorway, hands pressed against her mouth in horror, staring at the empty cradles where his children should have been sleeping. "They're gone," Nora managed to choke out between sobs. "I only stepped away for a moment. Alpha, I swear it. I only stepped into the hallway to fetch fresh linens, and when I returned, the window was broken, and they were simply gone." Marcus felt the world tilt violently around him, a wave of pure, animal terror, unlike anything he had ever experienced, clawing up through his chest. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, staring down at the empty cradles, at the shattered glass scattered across the floor, at a single dark smear of blood along the windowsill that made his blood run cold with dread. "Search the grounds!" he roared, his voice tearing through the pack house with such force that every wolf within earshot startled awake instantly. Every wolf, every corner of this territory, now. Within minutes, the entire pack had assembled despite the raging storm outside, wolves shifting quickly and racing out into the blinding snow to search desperately for any trace of the missing twins. Marcus led the search himself, his mind a chaotic storm of fear and self-recrimination, tracking scent trails that the fierce wind and heavy snowfall made nearly impossible to follow. Hours passed in increasingly desperate searching, the pack combing every inch of familiar territory and beyond, calling out into the storm, praying for some sign, any sign, that the twins might still be found alive. But as dawn finally broke gray and bleak over Blackwood territory, the search parties returned one by one, exhausted, frozen, and empty-handed. No trace of Ivy or Rowan had been found anywhere within the pack's extensive territory. The storm had erased any scent trail almost as quickly as it formed, leaving nothing behind but the shattered nursery window and that single ominous smear of blood as evidence of whatever had happened during those brief, unwatched moments in the night. Marcus stood in the ruined nursery as morning light finally filtered weakly through the storm clouds, staring at the empty cradles that had held his sleeping children just hours before, and felt something inside himself break completely. He thought of Elena's face in that final moment before she vanished into the storm 7 nights earlier, the quiet dignity and unshakable love in her eyes, even as he condemned her unjustly in front of the entire pack. He thought of his own arrogance, his own weakness in allowing Cassia's careful manipulations to convince him to cast aside the one wolf who would have died before ever letting harm come to their children. Whatever had happened to Ivy and Rowan, Marcus understood now with devastating clarity. He alone bore the responsibility for placing them in danger, by removing the one protector who truly would have kept them safe. And as the pack's collective grief settled over Blackwood like a suffocating shroud in the days that followed, Marcus began to realize that finding his children, if they could still be found at all, might require a truth far darker and more dangerous than anything he had previously imagined. A truth that traced back not to some outside threat, but to someone who had been standing within his own pack all along. News of the missing twins spread through Blackwood territory like wildfire, and within days, grief had settled over the pack like a heavy winter fog that refused to lift. Wolves who had barely known Ivy and Rowan personally found themselves weeping openly at the thought of two innocent pups lost to the storm, their small bodies perhaps buried somewhere beneath the snow, their fate unknown and unknowable. The pack house, once filled with the occasional sound of infant laughter and cooing, fell into an oppressive silence that seemed to seep into every corner of the building. Marcus barely left his study during those first days of mourning, consumed by guilt so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. He replayed every decision of the past week endlessly in his mind, searching for the exact moment where everything had gone catastrophically wrong. He should have investigated Cassia's accusations more thoroughly before condemning Elena. He should have trusted his own instincts about his mate, rather than allowing himself to be swayed by pressure and fear of appearing weak in front of the pack council. He should have posted additional guards around the nursery the moment the twins first fell ill, rather than trusting entirely in Nora's watchful eye and Edward's uncertain remedies. Nora herself had fallen into a deep depression following the twins' disappearance, blaming herself relentlessly, despite everyone's insistence that she could not have prevented what happened. She had stepped away for mere minutes, barely long enough to fetch fresh linens from the storage closet down the hall, and in that brief window of time, whatever had happened with terrible, silent efficiency. No wolf in the pack house had heard any struggle, any cry, any sound at all beyond the eventual shattering of glass that had finally drawn Nora's attention back to the nursery. Edward, too, seemed haunted by the twins' disappearance, spending hours poring over his healing texts, searching desperately for any clue as to what illness might have afflicted the pups in their final days before vanishing, as though understanding the sickness might somehow lead to understanding their fate. He found nothing conclusive, no answers that satisfied his decades of accumulated medical knowledge, and the mystery only deepened his sense of failure as the pack's healer. Cassia, throughout this period of collective grief, positioned herself as a steady source of support and comfort for Marcus, always present with soft words and gentle reassurance, always careful to redirect any lingering suspicion away from herself and toward vague outside threats. Perhaps a rival pack sought to weaken us by targeting our most vulnerable, she suggested during one particularly difficult evening, watching Marcus carefully for his reaction. The Ashford pack has grown increasingly aggressive along our northern border in recent months. Marcus considered this possibility seriously, and indeed, several council members began advocating for increased patrols and heightened defenses against potential Ashford aggression. But something about Cassia's explanation continued to nag uncomfortably at the edges of Marcus's grief-stricken mind, a persistent unease he could not fully articulate even to himself. The timing remained too precise, too convenient, the twins' mysterious illness beginning almost immediately after Elena's banishment, their disappearance occurring during a storm, violent enough to erase any useful evidence almost immediately. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the twins vanished, Marcus found himself standing alone in the ruined nursery, still not fully repaired despite the pack's efforts to move forward. He stared at the boarded-up window, at the faint stain on the floorboards where blood had once pooled before someone cleaned it away, and felt a fresh wave of grief and anger wash over him. "I failed them," he said aloud to the empty room, his voice hoarse with emotion he had been suppressing for weeks. "I failed all of them." He thought again of Elena, wondering where she was now, whether she had survived the harsh winter conditions alone in the wilderness, whether she even knew yet that their children had vanished into the same storm that had once carried her away from Blackwood. The thought of her learning this news, wherever she was, without any pack support, without anyone to comfort her through such devastating grief, filled Marcus with a fresh wave of shame, so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. He had cast her out based on lies, he was now almost entirely certain. Lies carefully constructed by someone within his own pack, for reasons Marcus could not yet fully understand. but increasingly suspected had something to do with ambition, with a desire to eliminate Elena's influence and perhaps position someone else more favorably close to the alpha's side. And in doing so, he had removed the one wolf who might have protected their children from whatever true danger had been lurking within Blackwood's own walls. Marcus made a decision that night, standing alone in the ruined nursery, with grief and determination warring fiercely within his chest. He would not simply accept the easy explanations Cassia continued to offer. He would investigate the truth himself, no matter how long it took, no matter what uncomfortable realities he might uncover about wolves he had trusted for years. His children deserved that much, even if they were already lost to him forever. And if there was even the smallest chance that Ivy and Rowan still lived somewhere out there in the vast wilderness beyond Blackwood's borders, Marcus intended to find them, whatever the cost to himself, or to the pack's fragile stability. He began quietly the following morning, questioning Nora more thoroughly about the days leading up to the twins' disappearance, pressing for details she might have previously overlooked or dismissed as insignificant. Nora, eager to help in any way possible after weeks of crushing guilt, recalled a detail she had not previously mentioned, uncertain of its relevance, until Marcus's careful questioning drew it back to the surface of her memory. "There was a scent," Nora said slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration, as she tried to recall the exact details. "Faint but present, near the nursery window in the days before they disappeared. I assumed it was simply an unfamiliar guest passing through the pack house, but now that I think on it more carefully, I never did identify whose scent it belonged to." Marcus felt a jolt of something sharp and urgent cut through his grief. "Could you identify this scent again, if you encountered it a second time?" Nora nodded slowly. "I believe so, Alpha. It was distinctive, somewhat sweet, almost like crushed herbs mixed with something colder underneath." Marcus's mind raced through the pack roster, considering which wolves might carry such a distinctive scent. Which wolves had access to the nursery in those final days before the twins' disappearance? Which wolves might have motive enough to harm two innocent pups for reasons that remained frustratingly unclear? Edward, as pack healer, regularly carried the scent of crushed herbs from his various remedies and treatments. But something cold underneath, Nora had said, something that did not quite match Edward's usual healing scent profile. He thought of Cassia then, of the careful, calculated way she had orchestrated Elena's banishment, of the convenient timing of the twins' illness immediately following, of her constant presence within the nursery under the guise of comfort and support throughout those difficult final days. Marcus had never paid particular attention to Cassia's personal scent, beyond recognizing her as a familiar pack member, but he resolved now to pay far closer attention, to watch her far more carefully than he had allowed himself to do throughout the entire crisis. That evening, Marcus arranged to meet with Cassia under the pretense of discussing increased northern border patrols, watching her closely as she settled into the chair across from his desk, noting for the first time the faint, sweet scent that clung to her clothing, a scent he now recognized with sudden, sickening clarity as remarkably similar to what Nora had described. He said nothing of his suspicions that evening, forcing himself to maintain a calm, professional demeanor throughout their discussion, even as his heart pounded with the terrible possibility, now taking firm root in his mind. But as Cassia left his study later that night, Marcus remained seated at his desk for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, grief and rage building steadily within him, as pieces of a much larger, much darker puzzle began slowly, painfully, to click into place. Somewhere out in the vast wilderness beyond Blackwood's borders, hidden among trees and snow that had swallowed all trace of their passing, Ivy and Rowan lay wrapped tightly in blankets within a small, hidden shelter, their small bodies still fighting against the strange sickness that had brought them to the very edge of death. And watching over them with fierce, unwavering determination, refusing to let sleep or exhaustion pull her away from her children even for a moment, sat Elena, an Omega wolf the pack believed had abandoned them completely, now engaged in the fight of her life to save the children she had never truly stopped protecting, even from a distance, even against impossible odds. Elena had felt it 3 nights after settling into the old trapper's cabin, a sharp, urgent pull deep within her chest that she recognized instantly as the mother bond crying out in distress. She had been drifting in and out of restless sleep when the sensation struck her with such force that she gasped awake, sitting bolt upright in the darkness, her heart pounding wildly. Something was terribly wrong with her pups. She could feel it as clearly as if she stood beside their cradles herself, a wrongness that resonated through the invisible thread connecting mother to children no matter the distance separating them. She had spent the following hours pacing anxiously within the confines of the small cabin, torn between the desperate urge to rush back toward Blackwood immediately and the knowledge that pack law forbade any contact, that returning uninvited would likely result in severe punishment, perhaps even death, for violating her banishment so directly. But as the distress signal through the bond only intensified with each passing hour, Elena found herself caring less and less about pack law, less about punishment, less about anything beyond the overwhelming primal need to reach her children before whatever threatened them succeeded in tearing them away from her forever. She waited 3 more agonizing days, watching the bond's distress signal fluctuate between manageable unease and moments of such sharp, terrible urgency that she nearly abandoned caution completely and raced back toward pack territory in broad daylight. During those long, anxious hours, Elena forced herself to think strategically, rather than purely emotionally, recognizing that a reckless approach would accomplish nothing beyond her own capture or death, leaving her utterly unable to help her children regardless of how desperately she wished to reach them. She began quietly gathering supplies from the surrounding forest, remembering everything her grandmother had ever taught her about wilderness survival and old Omega healing traditions. She collected specific herbs, known for their restorative properties, ones that grew even in harsh winter conditions if a wolf knew precisely where to search. She fashioned simple tools from fallen branches and stone, weapons crude but functional should she need to defend herself. She rationed what little food remained from her hasty departure from Blackwood, forcing herself to eat sparingly to preserve her strength for whatever lay ahead. On the 7th night since her banishment, as a fierce storm began building steadily overhead, the distress signal through the mother bond suddenly spiked with such devastating intensity that Elena cried out in pain, collapsing against the cabin wall, as the sensation nearly overwhelmed her entirely. She understood, instinctively, with the certainty only a mother's bond could provide, that something catastrophic was happening to her children at that exact moment, that whatever threat had been building steadily over the past week had finally reached its terrible culmination. Elena did not hesitate a moment longer. She gathered her meager supplies, wrapped herself as warmly as possible against the raging storm, and set out through the darkness and snow toward Blackwood territory, driven by pure maternal instinct that overrode every consideration of personal safety or pack law. The journey back was far more treacherous than her initial departure had been, the storm intensifying with each passing hour, wind howling through the trees with such ferocity that Elena struggled repeatedly just to remain upright against its force. She moved carefully once she reached the edges of familiar pack territory, using every tracking skill her grandmother had taught her to remain undetected, staying low and downwind of the main pack house, circling instead toward the nursery's exterior wall, where she knew from years of living within Blackwood exactly which window belonged to her children's room. Through the howling storm, she could just make out movement within the dimly lit nursery, a shadow that did not belong to Nora's familiar silhouette, someone smaller and quicker, moving with a furtive urgency that immediately set every protective instinct within Elena blazing to full alert. She crept closer, using the storm's chaos as cover, until she could finally see clearly through the frost-covered window glass. Her blood ran cold with horror at what she witnessed. Cassia stood within the nursery, moving quickly and efficiently, gathering both Ivy and Rowan from their cradles despite their weak, feverish whimpers of protest, wrapping them hastily in blankets, as though preparing to smuggle them away entirely from Blackwood territory, under cover of the raging storm. Elena did not think. She acted purely on instinct, years of careful tracking and stealth abandoned entirely in favor of raw maternal desperation. She struck the window with enough force to shatter the glass completely, ignoring the sharp pain as fragments cut across her forearm, and hauled herself through the opening in one fluid, desperate motion, landing hard on the nursery floor, in a scatter of broken glass and swirling snow. Cassia spun around in shock, nearly dropping the twins in her surprise, her expression cycling rapidly from alarm to calculated fury as she recognized exactly who had just burst so violently into the room. "You," she hissed, backing toward the far wall while clutching the whimpering twins protectively against herself, as though Elena herself posed the true threat in this scenario, rather than the reverse. "You should not be here. Your banishment forbids this." Give me my children, Elena said, her voice low and dangerous, every protective instinct within her screaming at full intensity as she took in the sickly pallor of her twins' faces, the visible fever burning beneath their skin, the terrible weakness evident in their labored breathing. Whatever you have done to them, whatever sickness you have caused, I will end it here and now. Cassia's eyes widened slightly with surprise, quickly masked by a sneer of contempt. You know nothing, she snapped, though something in her voice betrayed a flicker of genuine unease at having her plans so unexpectedly interrupted. These pups are a threat to everything I have worked toward, everything I deserve. Marcus should have chosen a stronger mate from the beginning, one worthy of standing beside an alpha, not some weak omega healer with delusions of importance. Understanding crashed over Elena with terrible clarity. Cassia had orchestrated everything from the very beginning, the false accusations that led to Elena's banishment, the mysterious illness that had nearly claimed her children's lives, all of it calculated ambition, aimed at eliminating Elena's influence and, apparently, eliminating the twins themselves in some desperate bid to secure a position of power beside Marcus that Cassia clearly believed she deserved far more than Elena ever had. You poisoned them, Elena said, horror and rage combining into something fierce and unstoppable within her chest. You have been slowly poisoning my children this entire time. Cassia's silence confirmed everything Elena needed to know. Without another word, Elena lunged forward, driven by pure maternal fury, determined to reclaim her children, no matter what stood in her way. The confrontation that followed was brief but intense, the two wolves grappling fiercely within the chaos of the storm blowing through the shattered window, snow and wind swirling violently around them as Elena fought with every ounce of desperate strength she possessed to wrest her precious children free from Cassia's grasp. In the end, it was Elena's fierce determination, fueled by a mother's unbreakable love, that won out. Cassia, startled by the intensity of an omega she had long underestimated, stumbled backward and fled through the nursery door and out into the storm beyond, disappearing into the darkness, rather than risk further confrontation with Elena's furious defense of her young. Elena did not pursue her. Her children needed her far more urgently than justice against Cassia did in that immediate moment. Gathering both twins carefully against her chest, feeling their feverish little bodies trembling weakly in her arms, Elena knew instinctively that she could not remain at Blackwood, could not risk staying in a place where pack law would see her captured and separated from her children once again, before she had any chance to heal them properly. She would need to disappear back into the wilderness immediately, taking her sickened pups with her, relying entirely on her grandmother's old healing knowledge to save them when Edward's considerable pack medicine had already failed completely. With the storm still raging fiercely around her and precious little time to lose, Elena wrapped her children as warmly as possible against her own body, climbed back through the shattered window into the freezing night, and disappeared once more into the vast wilderness beyond Blackwood's borders, carrying with her not just her precious twins but also the terrible truth of Cassia's betrayal, a truth she intended to bring back to Blackwood the moment her children were finally safe and strong enough to survive whatever confrontation still awaited them all. The days that followed tested every ounce of strength and knowledge Elena possessed. She moved quickly through the storm that first night, putting as much distance as possible between herself and Blackwood territory, before finally allowing herself to slow, her arms aching fiercely from carrying both twins pressed tightly against her chest for hours, through deep snow and biting wind. She eventually found a small hollow beneath the roots of an ancient fallen tree, sheltered enough from the worst of the storm to risk stopping, and settled there with her children, wrapping them as warmly as her limited supplies allowed. Ivy and Rowan remained frighteningly weak throughout that first night, their small bodies burning with fever, their breathing shallow, and labored in ways that filled Elena with a fear more profound than anything she had experienced even during her own banishment. She recognized some of the symptoms from her grandmother's old teachings, a slow, cumulative poisoning designed to weaken rather than kill outright, likely something Cassia had been introducing gradually into the twins' food or medicine over the preceding weeks, patient and calculated in her cruelty. Elena spent that first desperate night searching her memory frantically for every relevant lesson her grandmother had ever taught her about counteracting such poisons, using only what the forest itself provided. She recalled specific roots that, properly prepared, could help draw toxins from a young wolf's system. She remembered particular barks that, brewed carefully into a weak tea, could help stabilize a racing fever without the harsh chemical treatments Edward's more modern pack medicine typically employed. Working by feel in the darkness, guided by knowledge passed down through generations of careful, patient omega healers, Elena began preparing what remedies she could manage with the limited resources immediately available to her. She fed Ivy and Rowan the resulting mixture in small, careful doses throughout that first long night, watching anxiously for any sign of improvement, or, conversely, any sign that she might be making their condition worse through her own limited knowledge and resources. By dawn, both twins remained gravely ill, but their fevers had not worsened further. A small mercy Elena clung to desperately, as she finally allowed herself a brief period of exhausted, watchful rest. Over the following days, Elena established a careful routine, moving cautiously between temporary shelters to avoid detection, while continuing to administer her grandmother's remedies with painstaking precision. She foraged constantly for additional herbs and roots, expanding her treatment as she located new resources within the winter forest, always careful to remain alert for any sign of pursuit from Blackwood, knowing that Cassia would likely have reported the confrontation and set search parties in motion, though for what purpose exactly, whether to recapture Elena or to silence her permanently, remained an unsettling uncertainty. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Elena began to notice small signs of improvement in her children. On the fourth day since reclaiming them from Cassia's grasp, Rowan finally accepted a small feeding without immediately turning away, a tiny victory that brought tears of relief streaming down Elena's exhausted face. By the sixth day, Ivy's fever had finally begun to break, her small body no longer burning quite so fiercely beneath Elena's protective touch. Progress remained fragile and uncertain throughout, punctuated by moments of terrifying setback that sent Elena's heart racing with renewed fear each time. But overall, gradually, her children were healing. Elena herself suffered greatly throughout this period, sacrificing sleep and adequate nutrition consistently in favor of ensuring her children received every possible advantage in their recovery. She grew increasingly thin and exhausted as the days wore on, her own body weakening, even as she poured every remaining reserve of strength into nursing her twins back toward health. But she refused absolutely to allow herself any moment of true rest until she felt confident her children had truly turned the corner toward genuine recovery. She also remained constantly alert throughout this period for any sign of Blackwood search parties, moving her small temporary camp every day or two as a precaution, always staying close enough to observe pack territory from a careful distance, while remaining far enough away to avoid detection. During these careful observations, Elena began piecing together additional details about the aftermath of her confrontation with Cassia, information she gathered by observing pack movements and, occasionally, overhearing fragments of conversation carried on the wind from patrol wolves passing near her hidden position. She learned that Blackwood believed the twins had simply vanished during the storm, presumed lost or taken by some external threat, with no apparent connection drawn yet to Cassia's true involvement in their disappearance. This realization filled Elena with a complex mixture of relief and fury. Relief that Cassia's specific role remained apparently unknown to the pack, meaning Elena herself would not immediately be blamed or hunted for what had happened. Fury that Cassia continued moving freely within Blackwood, likely still positioned close to Marcus, still potentially plotting further harm against the pack, while everyone remained oblivious to the true danger residing within their own walls. Elena understood with growing clarity that simply hiding indefinitely in the wilderness, however successfully she managed to nurse her children back to health, was not a sustainable long-term solution. Eventually, she would need to return to Blackwood, would need to expose Cassia's true nature before the Pack Council, and, most importantly, before Marcus himself. But that confrontation would need to wait until her children were strong enough to survive both the journey back and whatever chaos might follow such a dramatic revelation. By the 10th day since reclaiming Ivy and Rowan from Cassia's grasp, both twins had improved significantly, their fevers fully broken, their appetites steadily returning, their small bodies beginning to regain some of the healthy color and energy that illness had stolen from them. Elena allowed herself, finally, a cautious measure of hope that her children would indeed survive this ordeal completely, that her grandmother's old healing knowledge had succeeded where Edward's more conventional pack medicine had failed entirely. But even as her children's health improved, Elena's own situation grew increasingly precarious. Her food supplies had dwindled dangerously low, exhausted by the demands of sustaining both herself and 2 recovering pups through the harsh winter wilderness. The temporary shelters she had been utilizing offered progressively less protection as the season's cold intensified further, and Elena recognized with growing urgency that she could not continue this precarious existence indefinitely without eventually risking all 3 of their lives to exposure or starvation. She began, therefore, formulating a careful plan for returning to Blackwood territory, timing her approach for a moment when she calculated the pack would be most receptive to hearing difficult truths, rather than reacting purely from shock or suspicion. She would need to choose her moment carefully, present her evidence clearly and calmly, despite the emotional weight of everything she had endured, and trust that Marcus, whatever mistakes he had made in banishing her so hastily, still retained enough wisdom and love for his children to recognize the truth when it stood directly before him, undeniable and impossible to ignore. On the 14th night since her banishment, with both twins finally strong enough to survive the journey, and a fresh, gentler snow beginning to fall softly, rather than raging with the storm's earlier fury, Elena gathered her few remaining supplies, wrapped Ivy and Rowan securely and warmly against her chest, and began the long walk back toward Blackwood territory, toward whatever confrontation and reckoning awaited her there, carrying with her not just her precious recovering children, but also the absolute, unshakable truth of everything Cassia had done, a truth she intended to lay bare before the entire pack, regardless of the personal cost it might demand of her. The final approach toward Blackwood took the better part of that night and into the early hours of the following morning, Elena moving carefully and deliberately despite her exhaustion, mindful of every sound and shadow within the surrounding forest, unwilling to risk detection before she was ready to make her presence known on her own terms, rather than being discovered and potentially captured before she had the chance to speak her truth. As dawn began breaking gently over the horizon, casting soft golden light across the fresh snow blanketing Blackwood's familiar territory, Elena finally reached the outer boundary markers. She recognized instantly despite the passage of 2 long weeks since her banishment. She paused there for a moment, gathering her courage, feeling Ivy and Rowan stir gently against her chest, their small breaths warm and steady now, a stark contrast to the labored, fevered breathing that had terrified her so profoundly in the days immediately following their rescue. "We are almost home," Elena whispered softly to her children, pressing a gentle kiss against each of their small foreheads. "Whatever happens next, know that your mother loves you more than anything else in this world, and I will never, ever, let anyone take you from me again." With that quiet promise settled firmly in her heart, Elena squared her shoulders, gathered every remaining ounce of strength and resolve she possessed, and stepped forward across the boundary line into Blackwood territory, prepared finally to face whatever awaited her, ready to reclaim not just her rightful place within the pack, but also the truth and justice that had been so cruelly denied to her and to her innocent children throughout this entire devastating ordeal. The 2 sentries stationed at Blackwood's main gate that early morning, a young wolf named Colin and his older companion Peter, had grown accustomed to a quiet, uneventful watch throughout the long, cold weeks since the twins' disappearance. The pack had settled into a kind of numb, grief-stricken routine, patrols moving methodically through their assigned territories, more out of habit than genuine expectation of encountering anything unusual. Neither Colin nor Peter expected, on this particular gray morning, to witness anything that would forever change the course of Blackwood's history. Colin noticed her first, a solitary figure emerging slowly from the tree line at the forest's edge, moving with obvious exhaustion but unmistakable determination. For a moment, he assumed it might simply be a lost traveler, or perhaps a wolf from a neighboring pack seeking shelter from the cold. But as the figure drew closer, something about her gait, something achingly familiar despite the weeks of separation, struck him with sudden, breathless recognition. "Peter," he said quietly, nudging his older companion sharply. "Look there. Is that not Elena?" Peter squinted through the pale morning light, his weathered face registering initial disbelief that quickly transformed into something far more profound, as recognition set in fully. "By the moon," he breathed, hardly able to believe what his own eyes were showing him. "It cannot be." But it was, unmistakably, undeniably Elena. walking steadily toward Blackwood's main gate, despite her visibly exhausted, frostbitten condition, her clothing torn and stained from weeks of wilderness survival, her once carefully maintained hair, now tangled and dusted heavily with fresh snow, that had settled across her shoulders during her long night's journey. And most strikingly of all, cradled carefully against her chest, wrapped snugly in blankets against the morning cold, were two small, unmistakable bundles that could only be one impossible thing. "The pups," Colin said, his voice barely more than a stunned whisper. "Peter, she has the pups." Neither sentry moved, for a long, frozen moment, too stunned by the impossible sight before them to react with anything resembling their trained procedures. Elena continued her steady approach, her exhausted but determined expression never wavering, until she finally stood directly before the gate, close enough now for both sentries to see clearly the fierce, protective love blazing in her tired eyes as she looked between them. "I need to see Marcus," Elena said, her voice hoarse from exhaustion, and cold, but carrying an unmistakable note of quiet, unshakable authority. "Immediately." Peter finally found his voice, though it emerged rough with shock and barely suppressed emotion. "Elena, everyone believed, we all thought the pups had been lost, taken during the storm weeks ago. The entire pack has been in mourning." "They were taken," Elena confirmed, adjusting the twins slightly against her chest, as they stirred gently at the sound of unfamiliar voices around them. "But not by any outside threat, as I suspect the pack has been led to believe. I have much to tell Marcus and the pack council, but first, please, I need warmth and rest for my children, and I need Edward to examine them properly, to confirm they have recovered fully from what was done to them." Colin, recovering some of his composure, immediately signaled toward the pack house, his voice carrying urgently across the still morning air. "Sound the alarm. Elena has returned, and she carries the twins. Alive." The response within Blackwood was immediate and overwhelming. Word spread through the pack house with astonishing speed, wolves emerging from their morning routines in various states of undress and confusion, drawn by Colin's urgent cries and the incredible, almost unbelievable news beginning to circulate rapidly among them. Within minutes, a substantial crowd had gathered near the main gate, staring in stunned disbelief at the sight of Elena standing there, exhausted and frost-dusted, but very much alive, cradling two small bundles that represented everything the pack had believed lost forever. Nora reached the gate first among the pack's inner household, having heard the commotion from her nearby quarters, and the moment she caught sight of the twins' familiar faces peering curiously out from their blankets, she collapsed to her knees with an overwhelming sob of pure relief and disbelief, her hands pressed against her mouth as tears streamed freely down her weathered cheeks. "They're alive," Nora managed to choke out between sobs. "Oh, thank the moon above. They're truly alive." Edward arrived moments later, his healer's instincts immediately overriding his shock as he moved quickly toward Elena, already reaching to examine the twins with careful, professional hands, even as his expression remained caught somewhere between amazement and profound relief. "May I?" he asked gently, and Elena, recognizing his genuine concern and professional expertise, nodded, allowing him to carefully check each twin's condition. "Their fever has broken completely," Edward murmured, genuine astonishment coloring his voice as he continued his examination. "Their color has returned, their breathing sounds clear and strong. Elena, whatever you did to nurse them back from such a grave illness, it worked remarkably. Far better than anything I managed to achieve during their time here at Blackwood." Elena offered him a tired, grateful smile, though her eyes remained fixed firmly on the pack house entrance, watching, waiting, for the one wolf whose reaction mattered more to her than any other in this entire crowd of astonished onlookers. And then, finally, she saw him, Marcus, emerging from the pack house at a full run, his expression a raw mixture of disbelief, hope, and desperate need to confirm with his own eyes that what he was hearing could possibly be true. He crossed the remaining distance between them in what felt like mere seconds, skidding to an abrupt halt directly before Elena, his eyes moving rapidly between her exhausted, frost-dusted face and the two small, precious bundles cradled so protectively against her chest. For a long, charged moment, neither of them spoke, the entire gathered crowd falling into a hushed, expectant silence as they watched this impossible reunion unfold before them. "Elena," Marcus finally managed, his voice cracking completely on her name. tears he made no effort to hide, beginning to fall freely down his face. Is it truly them? Are they truly alive? They are alive, Elena confirmed, her own composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of exhaustion and overwhelming emotion after everything she had endured over the past 2 devastating weeks. But Marcus, there is much you need to know, much that happened here at Blackwood, that you and this entire pack have been deceived about entirely. Marcus reached out slowly, almost reverently, his hands trembling as he gently touched first Ivy's small cheek, then Rowan's, confirming with his own senses that this impossible reunion was truly real, and not some cruel trick of grief and exhaustion playing tricks upon his desperate mind. When both twins responded to his touch with small, sleepy sounds of recognition, something within Marcus finally broke completely, and he sank to his knees before Elena, overwhelmed entirely by relief, gratitude, and a profound, crushing guilt that had haunted him relentlessly throughout every single day of the twins' disappearance. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice raw and broken, as he looked up at Elena from his kneeling position, uncaring entirely of how this appeared before the assembled pack. "I was wrong, so terribly wrong, to ever believe the lies told against you, to ever cast you out when you deserved nothing but my complete trust and protection." Elena looked down at him, exhaustion and lingering hurt warring visibly within her expression, alongside a deep, unwavering love that had never truly faded despite everything she had suffered. "We will speak of everything that happened, Marcus, I promise you that. But first, I need rest, and warmth, and time to properly recover alongside our children. The truth of what happened here, the truth of who truly threatened our pups, that conversation will require the full attention of this entire pack council, and it cannot wait much longer once I have gathered sufficient strength to speak it fully." Marcus rose slowly to his feet, nodding with fierce, immediate determination despite his continuing tears. "Whatever you need, Elena, it is yours. This pack owes you everything, and I intend to see that debt properly acknowledged and repaid, beginning this very moment." He turned then to address the assembled crowd, his voice regaining some of its familiar alpha authority, despite the emotion still evident beneath its surface. "Prepare warm quarters immediately, and summon every healer available, to ensure both Elena and our children receive whatever care they require. This pack will learn the full truth of what happened here, and justice will be served appropriately once that truth has been properly established." As pack members scrambled immediately to fulfill his instructions, Marcus turned back to Elena, offering his arms carefully to help support her should she need it for the remaining walk toward proper shelter and warmth. Elena hesitated only a moment before accepting his support, too exhausted after everything she had endured to refuse assistance any longer, though the wariness and hurt in her eyes made clear that forgiveness and full trust would require considerably more than this single dramatic reunion to fully restore between them. Together, they made their way toward the pack house, surrounded by a crowd of wolves still struggling to process the miraculous, impossible reality unfolding before them. Wolves who had spent the past 2 weeks mourning children they now realized had never truly been lost at all, protected instead by the very mother the pack had so unjustly cast aside. And somewhere within that watching crowd, absent entirely from the joyful reunion taking place at the gate, Cassia stood frozen, in silent, growing horror, understanding with dawning, terrible clarity, that her carefully constructed deception was about to unravel completely before the entire pack she had worked so hard to manipulate toward her own ambitious ends. Elena spent that first day back at Blackwood in careful, watchful rest, tended by Nora and Edward while Ivy and Rowan slept peacefully nearby, in a proper cradle, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Word of her return, and the miraculous survival of the twins, spread rapidly throughout every corner of pack territory, transforming the atmosphere from weeks of mourning into a complicated mixture of overwhelming joy and confused, uncertain questioning about exactly what had truly happened during those devastating 2 weeks of separation. Marcus remained close throughout that day, though he maintained a respectful distance whenever Elena needed rest, understanding intuitively that she required space and time to recover both physically and emotionally before any further conversation could take place between them. He spent much of the day instead quietly observing Cassia's behavior throughout the pack house, noting with growing suspicion her unusually subdued demeanor, her careful avoidance of the nursery, and the reunited family within it. Her hushed, urgent conversations, with a small handful of wolves, loyal specifically to her, rather than to the pack as a whole. By evening, once Elena had regained sufficient strength through rest and proper nourishment, she requested formally that the pack council be gathered the following morning to hear the full account of everything that had transpired since her banishment. Marcus agreed immediately, sending word throughout Blackwood that every council member, along with any pack wolves wishing to attend, should assemble at dawn, within the Great Hall, where Elena's banishment had originally been declared, a fitting location, Elena felt, for the truth to finally be spoken aloud, before everyone who had witnessed her unjust condemnation. That night, as Elena finally allowed herself proper, uninterrupted sleep for the first time in over 2 weeks, curled protectively beside her children's cradle, within familiar quarters she had once shared with Marcus, Cassia moved carefully through the pack house, under cover of darkness, her mind racing desperately for some way to salvage her rapidly crumbling position before the morning's council meeting could expose her completely. She considered, briefly, fleeing Blackwood entirely under cover of night, disappearing before Elena could formally accuse her of anything before the assembled pack council. But Cassia recognized quickly that flight would only confirm her guilt beyond any doubt, sealing her fate as a wolf hunted relentlessly by Blackwood, and likely every allied pack throughout the region, for her crimes against an alpha's own children. Staying and attempting to defend herself somehow, however difficult that prospect appeared given the overwhelming evidence Elena clearly possessed, seemed marginally less catastrophic than immediate flight. She spent the remaining hours before dawn, frantically considering various strategies for discrediting Elena's account, for casting doubt upon whatever evidence or testimony Elena intended to present before the council. She could claim Elena herself had poisoned the twins before her banishment, staging their later rescue purely to regain favor and position within the pack. She could suggest Elena's extended time alone in the wilderness had affected her mental stability, making her testimony unreliable and potentially delusional. Each strategy, however, felt increasingly desperate and unlikely to withstand serious scrutiny, particularly once Edward's professional medical examination of the twins was properly considered alongside Elena's testimony. As dawn finally broke over Blackwood territory, casting pale winter light across the assembled pack, gathering once again within the Great Hall, this time filled with an atmosphere of tense anticipation, rather than the grim finality that had characterized Elena's original banishment. Cassia took her position near the council seating, forcing herself to project an outward calm she absolutely did not feel internally, watching nervously as Elena entered the hall with Ivy and Rowan cradled protectively in her arms, Marcus walking supportively close beside her. The great hall fell into complete, expectant silence as Elena moved to stand before the assembled pack council, her exhausted but determined expression carrying an unmistakable weight of authority, despite her technically banished status. Marcus, standing beside her, addressed the gathered crowd first, his voice carrying clearly throughout the silent hall. 2 weeks ago, he began, I made a grave error in judgment, banishing my mate based on accusations I failed to properly investigate, before condemning her, before this entire pack. Today, Elena has returned to us, having saved our children's lives, through means that remain, as of yet, only partially understood, by myself and this council. I have asked her here this morning, to share the complete truth of everything that transpired, truth this pack deserves to hear in full, before any further judgment or decision is made, regarding anyone involved in these events. He turned then toward Elena, gesturing for her to proceed, and Elena, drawing a steadying breath, began recounting everything that had happened since that terrible night of her banishment, her voice growing steadily stronger and more confident as she spoke, carrying the weight of absolute truth that resonated clearly throughout the silent, attentive hall. She described the mother bond's urgent distress signal that had drawn her back toward Blackwood despite the danger of violating her banishment. She described discovering Cassia within the nursery that stormy night, actively attempting to remove the sickened twins from Blackwood, entirely under cover of the raging storm. She described the confrontation that followed, Cassia's desperate flight when confronted directly, and her own subsequent flight into the wilderness with her recovering children, relying entirely on her grandmother's old healing traditions to nurse them back from the very edge of death. Throughout Elena's account, gasps and murmurs of shock rippled steadily through the assembled crowd, wolves turning increasingly to stare toward Cassia's position near the council seating, watching her reaction carefully as the damning testimony continued unfolding before them. Cassia herself remained rigidly still throughout, her carefully maintained composure beginning visibly to crack under the weight of so many accusing stares directed steadily toward her. "This is absurd," Cassia finally interjected, unable to remain silent any longer, as Elena's account drew toward its conclusion. "This Omega abandons her children for weeks, then returns with some wild, unsubstantiated story, attempting to shift blame entirely onto myself. Where is your proof of any of this, Elena? I see none beyond your own convenient testimony." Elena turned to face Cassia directly for the first time since beginning her account, her expression steady and unwavering despite the challenge. "Nora identified a distinctive scent near the nursery window in the days before my children's disappearance. A scent she has since confirmed matches your own. Edward has examined my children thoroughly and can attest to the specific nature of the poisoning symptoms they displayed, symptoms consistent with slow, deliberate toxin exposure, rather than any natural illness. And I myself witnessed you directly, within the nursery, actively removing my children during the very storm that supposedly claimed them entirely." Edward stepped forward at this point, confirming Elena's account with his own professional medical assessment, describing in careful detail the specific symptoms the twins had displayed, and how those symptoms aligned precisely with known poisoning patterns, rather than any natural childhood illness he had previously encountered throughout his decades of pack healing experience. Nora too stepped forward, confirming clearly and without hesitation that the distinctive scent she had noticed near the nursery in the days before the twins' disappearance matched Cassia's own scent precisely. As the mounting evidence continued accumulating steadily against her, Cassia's careful composure finally shattered completely. "Fine," she snapped, her voice rising with barely suppressed fury and desperation. "Fine. I did it. I removed the twins. I poisoned them slowly over those weeks, all because Marcus was too blind to recognize that Elena was never truly worthy of standing as Luna beside him. I would have made a far superior mate, far more suited to leading this pack toward true strength and prosperity." Her admission, delivered with such raw, unrepentant ambition rather than any hint of genuine remorse, sent immediate shockwaves rippling through the entire assembled pack, wolves reacting with a mixture of horror, disgust, and righteous anger at hearing such a calculated betrayal confessed so openly before them all. Marcus stepped forward immediately, his expression hardening into cold, absolute fury as he processed the full weight of Cassia's confession. "You poisoned innocent pups," he said, his voice deadly quiet, despite the fury clearly building beneath its calm surface. "Manipulated me into banishing my own mate, based on fabricated lies, and nearly cost my children their very lives, all in service of your own selfish ambition." Cassia, recognizing finally that any hope of escaping consequence had entirely evaporated, straightened her posture with a kind of defiant, desperate pride. "I did what I believed necessary to secure this pack's proper future." "You will secure nothing further within this pack," Marcus declared, his voice carrying absolute alpha authority that silenced any remaining murmur throughout the hall. "By the authority granted to me as Alpha of Blackwood, I strip you completely of your rank and position within this pack. You are hereby banished from Blackwood territory, effective immediately, forbidden ever to return, under penalty of death, should you violate this decree." The Pack Council, without hesitation, voted unanimously to affirm Marcus's judgment, and within the hour, Cassia was escorted forcibly from Blackwood territory by a contingent of armed pack wolves, her banishment carrying none of the reluctant sympathy that had characterized Elena's own unjust exile weeks earlier, but rather a unified sense of justified relief that the true threat to Blackwood's future had finally been properly identified and removed entirely from their midst. As Cassia's forced departure concluded, and the assembled pack began slowly processing everything that had transpired throughout that dramatic morning, Marcus turned once again toward Elena, his expression carrying a profound weight of guilt, gratitude, and renewed determination, all mixed together into something raw and deeply sincere. "I owe you an apology far greater than words alone can properly convey," he said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the hall, despite being directed specifically toward Elena. "I failed you completely, failed our children, failed this entire pack, through my own weakness, in allowing manipulation, and fear, to override the trust and love I should have held steadfastly for you throughout this entire ordeal. Elena regarded him carefully, exhaustion and lingering hurt still visible beneath the relief and vindication she clearly felt at finally having the truth acknowledged so completely before the entire pack. Trust, once broken so severely, cannot be simply restored through words alone. Marcus, however sincere those words may be, rebuilding what we once shared will require considerable time, patience, and consistent demonstration of the trust and respect I deserved from the very beginning. Marcus nodded immediately, accepting her words without any hint of defensive protest. I understand completely, and I am prepared to spend however long necessary demonstrating exactly that trust and respect, both to you and to this entire pack, beginning with formally reinstating your position as Luna of Blackwood, a position you rightfully deserve, and one I should never have stripped from you, based on lies I failed to properly investigate. The assembled pack council, along with the broader gathered crowd, voiced their unanimous support for this decision, many wolves calling out expressions of gratitude and admiration for Elena's incredible strength and sacrifice throughout the entire devastating ordeal she had endured. Elena, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from weeks of exile and desperate struggle toward this moment of complete vindication and restored standing, allowed herself finally, for the first time since that terrible night weeks earlier, to feel a genuine measure of hope for the future awaiting herself, her children, and the pack she had never truly stopped considering her own, despite everything she had suffered. In the weeks that followed, Cassia's banishment and Elena's formal reinstatement as Luna, Blackwood slowly began healing from the trauma and division that had nearly torn the pack apart entirely. Marcus worked tirelessly to rebuild trust with Elena, demonstrating through consistent action, rather than mere words, his genuine commitment to earning back her full confidence and love. He consulted her directly on every significant pact decision, defended her judgment openly before the council whenever questions arose, and made a point of publicly acknowledging his previous failures whenever the topic arose among pack members still processing everything that had transpired. Elena, for her part, gradually allowed herself to soften toward Marcus once again, recognizing genuine, consistent change in his behavior, rather than empty apology alone. Their relationship, while forever altered by the pain of betrayal and separation they had endured, began slowly rebuilding itself upon a foundation of hard-earned mutual respect and renewed understanding, stronger perhaps in some ways than what they had shared previously, tempered now by genuine appreciation for what nearly had been lost entirely. Ivy and Rowan continued their recovery steadily, growing stronger and healthier with each passing week, their earlier illness fading gradually into distant memory, as they thrived once again within the safety and love of their reunited family. Elena found herself teaching Nora and even Edward some of her grandmother's old healing traditions, ensuring that valuable knowledge would remain available to Blackwood for future generations, rather than being lost entirely, a fitting tribute to the very wisdom that had ultimately saved her children's lives, when more conventional pack medicine had failed completely. The broader pack, too, began healing from the trauma of those devastating weeks, gradually restoring the sense of unity and trust that had been so severely tested by Cassia's calculated betrayal. Wolves who had once been swayed by Cassia's careful manipulation reflected honestly upon how easily fear and ambition had nearly succeeded in tearing their community apart, resolving collectively to remain more vigilant and more willing to question authority when instinct suggested something was genuinely wrong, rather than simply accepting convenient explanations without proper scrutiny. Several months after that dramatic council meeting, where the full truth had finally been revealed, Blackwood held a formal celebration marking not just the twins' full recovery and continued growth, but also the pack's renewed strength and unity, following everything they had collectively endured. The Great Hall, once the site of Elena's unjust condemnation, and later her powerful vindication, now filled with warmth, laughter, and genuine celebration, as the entire pack gathered to honor Elena's incredible strength and unwavering love that had ultimately saved not just her own children, but the pack's entire future as well. Marcus stood before the assembled crowd that evening, Elena beside him, with Ivy and Rowan, now considerably stronger and more animated pups, playing happily nearby, under Nora's watchful, joyful supervision. This pack owes everything to Elena's courage and unwavering devotion, Marcus declared, his voice carrying genuine pride and love throughout the hall. When we failed her most completely, she never once stopped fighting to protect what mattered most. Blackwood is fortunate beyond measure to call her Luna. The pack responded with enthusiastic, heartfelt cheers, wolves raising their voices in genuine celebration of Elena's strength and the family's remarkable hard-won reunion. Elena, watching her children play freely and happily nearby, surrounded by a pack that had finally recognized and honored her true worth, felt something within her chest finally settle into genuine peace after everything she had endured throughout this harrowing journey. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Marcus drew Elena aside quietly, taking her hands gently within his own, as he looked at her, with an expression carrying every ounce of love and gratitude he possessed. "I know words alone cannot fully repair everything that happened between us," he said softly. "But I promise you, Elena, every single day, for the rest of our lives together, I will work to earn back the complete trust and love you deserve. You saved our children when I failed them completely. You are the strongest, most remarkable wolf I have ever known, and I am endlessly grateful that you chose to return to us despite everything we put you through." Elena studied his face carefully for a long moment, seeing genuine sincerity and love reflected clearly in his eyes, love that had weathered profound testing and emerged stronger and more honest than it had ever been before. "We have both learned difficult lessons through this ordeal," she said finally, a soft, genuine smile beginning to form, despite everything she had endured. "But I believe we can build something stronger from here, Marcus, something built upon complete honesty and trust, rather than fear of appearing weak before others. Our children deserve that foundation, and honestly, so do we." Marcus pulled her gently into his arms, and Elena allowed herself finally to relax fully into his embrace, feeling for the first time in months a genuine sense of safety and belonging within Blackwood once again. Around them, the pack continued its joyful celebration, Ivy and Rowan's happy laughter carrying clearly through the warm evening air, a sound that had once seemed lost forever to the pack, but now filled Blackwood with renewed hope and promise for whatever future awaited this family and community that had endured so much, yet ultimately emerged stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. The story of Elena's incredible sacrifice and unwavering love for her children became something of a legend within Blackwood territory over the years that followed, told and retold to new generations of pups as a powerful reminder that true strength often comes not from rank or position, but from the depth of one's love and the courage to fight relentlessly for what truly matters most, no matter the odds stacked against them or the darkness that might temporarily obscure the truth. And within the walls of Blackwood, Elena stood always as living proof of exactly that enduring, unbreakable truth, a mother whose love had ultimately proven far stronger than any lie, any betrayal, or any storm that had ever dared to stand against her.